Do you remember the first time you watched a movie? It was probably so long ago that you only have a vague recollection of what it felt like. Some of you might have been around the big screen and moving images long enough to be conditioned to them. But for those who have a recollection of seeing a movie for the very first time, what was it like? I'm in the vague recollection camp. I don't remember how old I was or what movie we were watching. All I remember is feeling that it was very loud. Louder than anything I'd experienced before. It's hard to recall just how disorienting the whole affair of watching a movie is. For someone who's never had the experience before, what are they to make of this dark room where there are these images of giant people with rumbling sounds coming from all corners of the room? It must have been even stranger to be in the group of people who watched the very first films. These were black and white silent movies, and unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. There's plenty of stories about people's impressions of being in that room. Here's what Russian author Maxim Gorky wrote when watching one of those early films in the late 19th century. Yesterday, I was in the kingdom of the shadows. If only you know how strange it is to be there. There are no sounds, no colors. They're everything. The earth, the trees, the people, the water, the air is tinted in the single tone of gray. In a gray sky, there are gray rays of sunlight. In gray faces, gray eyes, and the leaves of the trees are gray like ashes. This is not life, but the shadow of life. This is not movement, but the soundless shadow of movement. I must explain, lest I be suspected of symbolism or madness. I was at Almost Cafe and saw the Lumiere cinematograph, the moving photographs. The impression it produces was so unusual, so original and complex, that I can hardly convey it in all its nuances. But I can attempt to convey its essence. A railway train appears on the screen. It darts like an arrow straight towards you. Look out. It seems as if it is about to rush into the darkness in which you are sitting and reduce you to a mangled sack of skin, full of crumpled flesh and shattered bones, and destroy this hall and this building, so full of wine, women, music, and vice, and transform it into fragments of dust. It's hard to believe that this was the reaction such a crude film evoked in people. But what a thrill it must have been to be there. And here we are more than 100 years later, probably bewildered by this reaction, precisely because cinema has become so ubiquitous. And how different are movies today compared to the image of a train way back then? It took a while for cinema to come on its own as an art form. As a storytelling medium, what can cinema do that theater and literature can't? What are its capabilities? What is its potential? It took a lot of people, a lot of tinkering, and a lot of theorizing to answer these questions. So of course, Hollywood developed most of what the industry looks like today. But it wasn't alone. Multiple different industries also came on their own throughout the 20th century. And that's what this podcast is all about. Alt.culture. The cultural influences that we have today that's off the beaten path of conventional art history. I want to take a global look at this history, at things that were influential but overlooked. I would argue that one of the most influential but overlooked development of cinema was the cinema of the Soviet Union. Some of you might be surprised by this. I know that when I told a couple of people about my idea for these episodes, responses were skeptical, bemused, and cynical. Did the USSR really have a cinema, let alone one worth talking about? Was it really that influential? Yet you have directors like Eisenstein, Tarkovsky, and Vertov, names you'll be well acquainted with by the end of the series, frequently top the list of best directors of all time. When I thought about starting this podcast, I had 3 goals in mind. I wanted to tell interesting stories about interesting times and interesting people. I wanted to discuss and think out loud questions of art and culture, and share some ideas and get into dialogue with all of you. I also wanted to give some recommendations on works of art that might pique your interest. The history of Soviet cinema, I believe, will do all 3. These were certainly interesting times, filled with a big cast of colorful, bizarre, heroic, and villainous characters. I hope you'll be able to check out some of the works I'll be talking about and form your own opinions about them. And the evolution of the cinema industry in the USSR will definitely cover a lot of questions concerning art, from the value of experimentation, the nature of cinema, avant-garde versus the mainstream. the role of government intervention, bureaucracy and censorship, and so much more. In the next 4 episodes, we'll cover large trends in the country and its industry. Episode 1 will cover the beginnings of the Soviet Union and experimental avant-garde cinema. Episode 2 will take us through the darker periods of history, Stalinism and the Second World War. Episode 3 will cover the post-Stalinist era, where the Soviet film industry finds its identity and explores different genres. Episode 4 will take us to the very end, where movies reflected the unease and turbulence of the era. So let's start. First, some background. The main focus of our episode will be on the 1920s. By that time, so much has already happened, so we do need to set the stage concerning the founding of the USSR, the Russian Revolution that brought it to life. The history of the Russian Revolution is fascinating, and there are so many books, documentaries, and videos that cover the subject. There's a lot to explore which sadly we just won't be able to. I'll try my best to paint a clear picture of what happened, while acknowledging that this description barely scratches the surface. So here it is. The Russian Empire was ruled by the Tsar. Troubles had been brewing for a while with the last Tsar, Nikolai II. A terribly heavy-handed response to a protest in 1905 almost caused a revolution. The Tsar agreed to install a parliament as a compromise, but he also chose to ignore that parliament. At the same time, a cluster of councils and unions popped up all over the empire and gained in political power. In 1914, Tsar Nikolai enters World War I. This did not make him any friends. In 1917, a group of women protested rising prices, things escalated, and the Tsar abdicated the throne in what is known as the February Revolution. A bourgeois government, the Provisional Government, took power, but shared it with other factions, including those councils and unions mentioned before, known in Russia as the Soviets. A blistering summer of intrigue, conspiracies, broken promises, and an attempted fascist takeover led to more escalations of conflict, where eventually one of the Soviet factions, the Bolsheviks, stormed the Winter Palace and took control. This was the October Revolution. Things were far from over. The Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, were nominally in power, but solidifying control over the vast former Russian Empire against competing factions led to a brutal series of battles and conflicts known as the Russian Civil War. In 1922, the Bolsheviks emerged as the undisputed rulers of the territory, and in December of that year, Lenin names his new dominions the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Now, some of you might find this explanation unsatisfying. Calling Bloody Sunday a heavy-handed response, or writing off the whole Kornilov affair in 3 words might cause an aneurysm in history buffs. Like I said, entire books have covered this period alone. The aim here was to leave you with a few takeaways. There was a revolution in the Russian Empire, multiple different factions attempted to take power, and it was finally the Bolsheviks who consolidated their rule, but not without contention. So where does cinema fit into all of this? Picture this. It's the summer of 1918, and a peculiar train is getting ready to depart. The train was 15 cars long, and if you were to walk around, you would admire the paintings covering the exterior. These brightly colored, sharp angles, dynamic imagery, and fonts. The popular turn of the 20th century mural style you can still see in major cities today. The paintings were revolutionary pictures of workers, soldiers, socialists. Take a peek inside and you would see boxes of leaflets, perhaps a musical instrument or two, and the latest of technological wonders, a film projector. This is one train of many that would circle around the former Russian Empire, from Volga to Tashkent, from the eastern frontiers to the European borders. These trains all bore names of great significance to the Bolsheviks. The Lenin, the October Revolution, the Red East, the Soviet Caucasus, the Red Cossack. Their mission was also of great significance to the Bolsheviks. These were the Agit trains. And in the summer of 1918, the very first one, the Lenin, was departing. These Agit trains had a mission. As all of you know, the Russian Empire was vast. It included peasants and villages of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Most were illiterate. The Bolsheviks realized they needed the support of these people to consolidate their power. They realized the need to educate this multilingual, multi-ethnic group. Before the revolution, the Bolsheviks' main form of gaining support was through leaflets and lectures. This was something that you would mainly see in cities. It was a very urban response. It was directed at workers within those cities. But now their target was just so much wider, and some couldn't even speak Russian. And even if they could, they most likely weren't able to read the pamphlets. So what could the Bolsheviks do? If you were a villager, and your village was visited by one of these agit-trains, you'd be treated to a spectacle of artwork, music, and movies. Now this is the first time you, the villager, have ever seen a movie. The first time seeing these giant projected images showing you battles, world historical events, and new industrial technologies promising to make your life and work easier. Can you imagine how big of an impact this must have had? The success of the trains was in no small part due to this new technology of the masses. Children especially were drawn to these screenings, sitting in awe at the moving pictures, all promising a better world for them and their family. Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood early the importance of winning over the hearts and mind of the people. Propaganda and agitation. Now, these names might make us wince today, but they didn't have the same negative connotations in this context. Lenin's writing distinguished between the two, calling propaganda the written form of education. More theoretical and dealing with the condition of people in general. Agitation was more direct, more visceral, drawing people's attention to real events related to their lives, their condition, and pointing to ways that they can get out of the mire they found themselves in. To use an example from Lenin's writings, propaganda would deal with the subject of unemployment broadly, with the contradictions of a class that gets richer while another gets poorer. On the other hand, agitation would tell the story of a single unemployed worker, his starving family, and the misery of their lot. The difference between Karl Marx and Charles Dickens. The documentary pictures shown on the trains were a major source of this agitation. So movies were off to a good start with the new regime. But all of this is very functional, very utilitarian. Were movies really nothing but a form of agitation for political uses? Well, yes and no. The political use of movies will definitely be a running theme throughout the next few years. But there was also a recognition that movies needed to have entertainment and artistic value as well. It's just that, despite the success of the trains on the countryside, things weren't doing so well for cinemas in the cities. Cinema fell under the purview of the Commissariat of People's Enlightenment, replacing the former Ministry of Culture. The head of this commissariat, Lunacharsky, was in charge of culture and education. And it seems like, for all intents and purposes, he was someone genuine about his support for the arts. He was someone who stood up to criticism from other members of the party and was always ready to defend the arts he oversaw. This didn't stop people from getting nervous though. The film industry was, let's say, apprehensive about the new regime. Some viewed it as a mere aberration. Forget about it, boys. Just sit back and wait. These Bolsheviks, they won't last. As a result, a lot of entrepreneurs of cinema hid their film stock and left the country, being certain that they would return. Of course, this fad ended up lasting for 70 years, and some of these emigres would never return. Add to the fact that film stock and equipment was already in short supply. Remember the World War Russia was in against Germany? While Germany was previously a trading partner for film stock and camera equipment, Kodak, remember them? So the war not only cut off one of their main trading partners, it also made it difficult for movies from France or the US, for example, to make it through. And then, in 1919, Lenin enacted a series of war measures to respond to the Civil War. This involved tighter control on the economy and nationalization of industries. These measures were known as war communism. Lunacharsky signed in the all-Russian photographic section of Narkompros. That's the Russian portmanteau for the People's Enlightenment, effectively having the entire cinema industry under the control of the commissariat. And all the way up to the final act of nationalization, the industry pushed back hard. Rumors of nationalization were already in circulation, and the old guard would have none of it. They wrote articles denouncing the idea of nationalizing the cinema industry. Producers hid away their film footage. The film councils called for boycotts of any theaters which were under government control. Add to the fact that whatever technology or talent there was available were concentrated on the agit trains. If you were out and about in Petrograd, what would you do for entertainment? While cinemas had no choice then but to show either imports from Hollywood or films shot and directed during the Russian Empire era. For the department that cared about the education and enlightenment of the people, this was not an easy compromise. It just didn't seem appropriate to be screening films full of bourgeois values in the middle of a civil war. One of the ways the party tried to counteract any harmful ideological tendencies was to have a party member lecture the audience of a movie. While the audiences were sitting back and relaxing, wanting a bit of amusement to watch some slapstick antics or sweet melodrama, they'd have to contend with a Bolshevik talking about how bad the message of the movie was. Imagine if every time you watched a sci-fi movie, Neil deGrasse Tyson would be there right next to you, yelling about the scientific inaccuracies in the film. Suffice to say, the plan didn't last long. So all of these measures were obviously temporary. Something needed to be done. A new generation of cinematographs had to be educated. And in 1919, the State Film School was founded. The State Film School, also known as the Moscow Film School, was the first cinema school in the world. This opened the door to fresh blood, a younger cohort of cinematographers who might also be more amenable to the new regime. Cinema was building its theoretical and experimental foundations that are essential to the films we watch today. And this was in no small part thanks to the State Film School established in 1919. For our purposes, the focus will be on one particular workshop, led by a former art student named Lev Kuleshov. The Kuleshov Workshop, as it was called, revolutionized film forever. Of course, things weren't easy for this new film school or workshop. This was still the Civil War era, there was still a shortage of stock, and whatever was left went to the newsreels and agitation film. So a film school without film, what are they to do? Film without film. That's what Kuleshov called his series of experiments. He and his students would theorize, analyze, and experiment with whatever limited stock they had. And one of their favorite movies to analyze was Intolerance by Dw Griffith. Well, Griffith himself, of course, being an extremely controversial figure in cinema, and with very good reason, but that's for another podcast. What Kuleshov and his students were doing, basically, was analyzing the most critically acclaimed movies of the time and breaking them apart, seeing what makes them tick. Like a chemist in a lab subjecting the element to different stresses to discover new things about it. The workshop made experiments to get a theoretical understanding of what good directors were intuitively doing. They then were able to isolate these actions, give them a language, and amplify them. The art that was generally regarded as mere entertainment was now getting its artistic roots. The workshop believed they found what made cinema cinema. Let's take a look at one of their most famous experiments, called the Kuleshov Effect. It goes like this. You have a still image of an actor. His facial expression is fairly blank. Then you see another image right after. It's a bowl of soup. The audience was asked, "What is the man feeling?" "Well, hungry," they would reply. Then they would be shown the same actor, same expression, but another image after it. A child in a coffin. The man is sad. It's tragic. Then finally again, same image, same expression, same man, but right after it, a young woman lying on a divan, seductively glaring at the screen. Well, we all know what he's feeling. Cinema, these experiments suggested, wasn't in the acting, wasn't in the scenery or the plot, the characters, the music, or the script. The essence of cinema, what made it different from the other arts, is the editing. It's interesting, as an aside, that this is an era where there was a whole lot of experiments with perception going on. You had the perception-bending works of the modernist artists like Cubism. You also had the ideas of Gestalt psychology, which argues that humans fill in the blank of perception with incomplete information. Maybe you've seen that picture? Let me try and describe it. You have three figures, three Pac-Man-like shapes. One is facing left, opposite to that is one facing right, and then the one on top facing down. When you see this image, you can't help but see a triangle. Your mind just completes the shape for you. Kuleshov's montage techniques kind of work in a similar fashion, where you fill in the blank with what's on the screen. Kuleshov believed that his editing techniques could not only produce new emotions in people, it could also create entirely new places. This would involve taking shots of different locations unconnected to one another, but then when you put them together in a movie, it looks like they are a single place, a place that doesn't exist in reality. This had not only artistic, but practical advantages too, since you could save time and money on building sets. Here's Kuleshov in his own words, describing setting up a scene in the old way versus in his new way of doing things. He describes in characteristic Russian, light-hearted good cheer, a scene of a man in the office who succumbs to despair and kills himself. In Russia, the scene would be shot in the following way. The camera was set in place, facing the set, and it was reasoned thus. The man lives in a room, therefore it is necessary to build a room. We can't build 4 walls, so let's build 3. In the room, we must have windows and doors. The room must have wallpaper, flowered wallpaper. Let's paper the walls. Paintings are hung on the walls. Flowers are placed on the windowsills. There must be a chest and a stove. We place all this in the room. The desk has writing implements, just as in reality. An actor sits at the desk, imagines that he's feeling terribly despondent, takes a pistol from the desk drawer, brings it to his temple, and fires. The cameraman films this entire scene, develops it, prints it, projects it onto the screen, and when the viewer looks at the scene, he simultaneously sees the curtain on the windows, the paintings on the wall, and so on. He sees a tiny actor among a large assortment of things. And while the actor is performing the juiciest psychological suffering, the viewer might be examining the leg of the writing table or the painting that is hung on the wall. That is, the spectator receives an extraordinarily distracted account of what is taking place on the screen. The Americans filmed things completely differently. They divided each separate scene into montage sequences, into a series of shots that made up the sequence. In addition, they shot each separate movement in a way that only its action was visible, only that which was categorically essential. Even in long shot, they constructed scenery so that the details were not noticed. If they needed to achieve the impression of a room, they would achieve it by some simple detail. If the wallpaper design did not have a particular function, walls were darkened or blackened, and only those objects were left in the light which were essential to the incident. Besides that, everything was shot in what is called close-up. That is, when it was necessary to show the face of a person suffering, they showed only his face. If he opened the drawer of a desk and took a pistol from it, they showed the desk drawer and the hand taking the pistol. When it came to pressing the trigger, they filmed the finger pressing the trigger, because other objects in the surroundings in which the actor worked were irrelevant at this particular instant. This method of filming only that moment of movement essential to a given sequence and omitting the rest was labeled by us the American method, and it was thus placed in the foundations of the new cinematography which we are beginning to form. Kuleshov calls this the American method, which I think is pretty ironic because he and his successors will be the ones to fully grow this technique to fruition. So here we have it, the essential contribution of the Kuleshov workshops. Placing the essence of cinema in the editing room would define how Soviet filmmakers viewed their art in the 1920s. So that's Kuleshov as a theoretician, but what about as a movie maker? He had an eclectic style, applying his techniques to various genres. You got the sci-fi movie Death Ray. You got By the Law, based on Jack London's short story. You also have my personal favorite of Kuleshov's movies, The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. I love this movie. It's silly, fun, and lighthearted, a slapstick comedy that only the silent movie era could make. Something like Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, or Charlie Chaplin. It's funny in the way that it depicts stereotypes, misinformation, and propaganda, both intentionally and not. The protagonist of the story, Mr. West, the director of the YMCA, is on a mission to save Russia from the dastardly Bolsheviks. Before he leaves, he gets a letter saying, "We are sending you some New York magazines that depict the barbarous state of Russia today." He then gets pictures of 2 gloriously mustached villains with crazed, bloodshot eyes, menacingly brandishing a hammer and sickle at the camera. The failing New York Times spreading fake news, folks. Which is not to say that stereotyping doesn't go both ways. When Mr. West arrives in Russia, he's wearing just the gaudiest fur coat and waving a miniature American flag around. His bodyguard is a literal cowboy. In Russia, he encounters reactionary swindlers who play up the stereotypes from the New York magazines, in order to extort money from him. All's well and good at the end, though, in the hilariously unintentional depiction of propaganda when a real Bolshevik saves Mr. West. Rather than the cartoonish villain, this Bolshevik is a tall, strapping, and handsome young man who takes Mr. West to see Lenin's speeches, which was real footage that Kuleshov strung together for the movie. Mr. West is inspired by what he sees and converts to Bolshevism. The end. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where we left off, the workshop in 1920. Actually, no, in fact, let's move forward a few years to look at the state of the society. To recap, the Civil War ends and the USSR is officially established in 1922. The end of the Civil War also marked the end of war communism, the emergency measures enacted before. In its place, Lenin introduces a new economic policy, known as the New Economic Policy. The NEP, as it is better known, returns some economic control to private enterprise. And even more importantly for the film industry, the USSR reopened trade with Western countries, allowing imported films and technology back in. Artists, cinematographers, and theoreticians were eagerly looking forward to this new era. It was a culturally dynamic time. The art community was looking to do something new. They had a thirst for new forms of innovation. And cinema was one of the symbols of the new generation. They saw the potential for movies to go far beyond what it had been up to that point. The movies produced were still stuck in old world values. They relied too heavily on conventions from literature and theater. Experiments like those of Kuleshov showed that the medium of film, its juxtaposition of images, its movement, even the camera itself, had a lot more to offer. And there were those who were just itching to experiment more. Here's Zika Vertov, someone we'll be talking about more soon, writing a manifesto called We. We proclaim the old films based on romance, theatrical films and the like to be leprous. Keep away from them. Keep your eyes off them. They're mortally dangerous, contagious. We affirm the future of cinema by denying its present. Cinematography must die so that the art of cinema may live. We call for its death to be hastened. And later on, we are in search of the film scale. We fall, we rise, together with the rhythm of movement slowed and accelerated, running from us, past us, towards us, in a circle or straight line or ellipse, to the right and left with plus and minus signs. Movements bend, straighten, divide, break apart, multiply, shooting noiselessly through space. Drawings in motion, blueprints in motion, plans for the future, the theory of relativity on the screen. We greet the ordered fantasy of movement. Our eyes, spinning like propellers, take off into the future on the wings of hypothesis. We believe that the time is at hand when we shall be able to hurl into space the hurricanes of movement, reined in by our tactical lassos. Hurrah for the dynamic geometry, the race of points, lines, planes, and volumes. Hurrah for the poetry of machines, propelled and driving, the poetry of levers, wheels, and wings of steel, the iron cry of movements, the blending grimaces of red-hot streams. Cool. The bombast, the dramatic flair, the self-assured optimism. You couldn't write things like this anymore. This was definitely a young man's game. And I do want to emphasize young. Not just a young nation, but young artists as well. Kuleshov, the man we spent some time with before, the one who sparked off these creative investigations, yeah, he was 20 years old when he started his workshop. All the other cinematographers we'll be talking about were also in their 20s when this was happening. Another thing I need to address here is that some of the movies we'll be looking at might seem to us like some kind of cynical propaganda. We have the benefit of hindsight 100 years later, and all of us have opinions about this era. But what I'm trying to do here is to get into the mind of the people as they were living out these historical events. The makers of the movies, for all intents and purposes, seemed like they truly believed in the cause. When examining the writings of Vertov, of Kuleshov, and Eisenstein in this era, they did have a conviction that the proletariat revolution meant a revolution in the arts as well. Things were changing, and they wanted to be at the forefront of that change. There was little friction, it seems, between the ideology of the state and the ideology of the artists, for the time being. The industry, meanwhile, was experiencing growing pains. The party reaffirmed their commitment to cinema being an important tool to educate the masses, including Lenin's slogan, "To us, cinema is the most important of the arts." Goskino was created to oversee the industry, primarily the distribution of movies across the country. But from the very beginning, they encountered issues. You see, although the party talked about the importance of cinema, it didn't put its money where its mouth was. Poor government subsidies and high taxes on theatergoers meant that seats were not getting filled. People weren't going to the movies and theaters shut across the country. By 1924, the industry was just a fraction of what it used to be. And the party took notice. There was also the issue that the cinemas of the USSR, they relied too much on foreign imports. American movies were far more prevalent than homegrown films. They needed better output. Goskino and Lunacharsky pleaded their case about the subsidies and taxation issues, and a general investigation on the state of cinemas led to similar conclusions. So subsidies were increased, tax burdens decreased, and a new industry regulator, the Sovkino, was established. This was 1925, and this is when the most famous directors would start coming on their own. All were making films before this, but it was only now, in 1925, that their true masterpieces were about to emerge. We'll be looking at 4 today. These were Vsevolod Pudovkin, Sergei Eisenstein, Zika Vertov, and Alexander Davjenko. Pudovkan, in certain respects, was a successor to Kuleshov. He studied engineering at Moscow University till he got conscripted in the army for World War I. Pudovkan was captured by the Germans and stayed in captivity till the end of the war. Upon returning to Russia, he decided to give up his original career path and went into cinema instead. This is where he studied under Kuleshov, who by the way was 6 years younger than Pudovkan. He had a successful debut with his comedy short Chess Fever in 1925, and later in 1926, he created the first of his trilogy of revolutionary movies, Mother, an adaptation of Maxim Gorky's novel. Maxim Gorky, remember him? He's the guy that talked about movies at the beginning of the episode. The 3 films, Mother, End of St. Petersburg, and Storm over Asia, each depict downtrodden people being forced by circumstance to rise up against their oppressors. All the kind of stuff that the Bolsheviks loved to depict. These films also greatly expanded upon, refined, and matured the theories of Kuleshov. I'm not saying, by the way, that Pudovkan was just a follower of Kuleshov. He disagreed with his former teacher in regards to movie making, particularly on the use of montage, which is a good study in contrast with the next cinematographer, Eisenstein. In a famous picture of him, you see his big eraserhead style hairdo, this intense laser-like focus on film stock that he's cutting, and that depicts him perfectly. Intellectually curious, passionate about the arts, cinema was his life. And what an interesting life it was. He'll eventually encounter all sorts of important artists on the left, like Upton Sinclair and Frida Kahlo. I would love to do an entire episode just on his biography. But for now, here are 2 anecdotes that might give you an idea of his character. It's the February Revolution of 1917. The streets are in utter chaos. Protesters, soldiers, policemen, Cossacks on horseback. And where was Eisenstein in all of this? Well, he was writing notes on the event while he was on his way to the theater. The biggest letdown of the day for Eisenstein was to find the play cancelled, postponed due to revolution. Another story. While deployed during the Civil War, Eisenstein is placed to work with a professor of Japanese. The young man takes this opportunity to study kanji, the 2,000 plus ideograms of the written language, and learn about the arts of Japan. His service gave him inspiration to later write an essay on how kabuki and kanji can influence modern cinema. Eisenstein briefly workshopped with Kuleshov, where he also met Pudovkan. They would collaborate in movies later, both behind and in front of the camera. But his early works were in the experimental theaters. Strike is the first film of his to make it big. But it was his other 2 movies, Battleship Potemkin and October, that rocked the world. Both films depict major historical events. Battleship Potemkin was a massacre that occurred in 1905 when a group of sailors complained that their food had too many maggots. The captain responded by shooting the sailor's representative. Riots ensued. This incident was firmly in the Bolsheviks' repertoire to criticize the former regime. October deals with, appropriately enough, the October Revolution. We'll go into details later. Far from being documentary movies, these films are still remembered for their artistic achievements. Battleship Potemkin features a scene where a fight breaks out on the steppes and chaos ensues. The Odessa steppe sequence, as it is known, is one of the most admired, studied, and replicated scenes in movie history. I would recommend taking a look at it and recognizing just how many movies have copied this sequence. Both October and Potemkin did very interesting things with the editing of the movies, a technique known as montage. Aha, montage. Anyone familiar with Soviet theory is probably going, well, he finally gets to it. Yes, montage. From the French word meaning to set up a scene, montage was editing taken to the nth degree. It took the results of the Kuleshov Effect and expanded on them to make entire scenes, entire films. Pudovkan and Eisenstein cut an interesting pair. The word that we could use to describe them today would probably be frenemies. The two worked with editing and montage. They were highly theoretical about the nature of cinema. They had different temperaments and approaches to these ideas. This can be illustrated by taking an in-depth look at how they viewed editing and montage. I'm going to be spending a little bit of time here to outline their theories. Pudovkan talked about 5 editing techniques, while Eisenstein espoused 5 different methods of montage. So we'll have 10 techniques in total. I hope that as I'm describing these, your mind will automatically come up with examples and make associations with movies that you've seen before. These techniques are ubiquitous nowadays. It's just a matter of noticing them. So first, Pudovkan's 5 editing techniques. The aim of these techniques is to produce an emotional reaction in the audience that would not have been possible with one shot alone. Remember the Kuleshov principle on top? Here is Pudovkan himself on editing. Editing is not merely a method of the junction of separate scenes or pieces, but is a method that controls the psychological guidance of the spectator. The 5 techniques are contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. Contrast is, quite simply, 2 opposing scenes. The aim is to bring out the emotional tone of the piece even more strongly through this contrast. Suppose it be our task to tell of a miserable situation of a starving man, Pudovkan writes. The story will impress us more vividly if associated with the mention of the senseless gluttony of a well-to-do man. This is a simple enough psychological principle. We perceive things through contrast. A tall person will look even taller if standing next to a shorter person. A good singer sounds better if a terrible singer belted out a song before them. Contrast makes things more vivid. Then we have parallelism. These are also 2 connecting scenes, but not as a way to show the difference between one and the other. Parallelism connects the story to a wider world by showing more than one thing happening, which gives us the impression that there is something that is going to connect the 2. 2 different shots of strangers walking, for example, can give the idea that the 2 will bump into each other. It can also be used as an interesting transition technique. So Alfred Hitchcock, he did this quite a bit. You'd have, for example, a scene that ends with a woman screaming, and then the audio of the scream morphs into a whistle of a train, transitioning to the next scene. Next is symbolism. While parallelism is usually a way of connecting the content of a movie, symbolism has more to do with the meaning. The 2 shots don't necessarily have to be connected plot-wise. They point to an overall message, probably something like a visual metaphor. Here's an example Pudovkan gives on Eisenstein's movie. In the final scenes of the film Strike, the shooting down of workmen is punctuated by shots of the slaughter of a bull in the stockyard. The cinerist, as it were, desires to say, just as a butcher fells a bull with the swing of a poleaxe, so cruelly and in cold blood were shot down the workers. This method is especially interesting because, by means of editing, it introduces an abstract concept into the consciousness of the spectator without use of a title. These are silent movies, right? So they would have subtitles explaining what was going on in the scene. So here, instead of just having a title card that says that the people are being slaughtered, Eisenstein chose to have a visual representation, a visual metaphor, like we said earlier. Abstract concept into the consciousness of the spectator. This was what Eisenstein was most interested in, as we shall see soon. So after symbolism, we have simultaneity. As the name implies, this is when actions are happening at the same time, usually as a way of ratcheting up tension. You can imagine the end of an action movie where two battles are raging at the same time. The camera jumps back and forth between the two. Or when the hero and the villain are in a race to reach the desired goal first. Very familiar Hollywood third act. In fact, even way back then, Pudovkan saw the shots as a very American way of ending movies. In American films, the final section is constructed from the simultaneous rapid development of two actions, in which the outcome of one depends on the outcome of the other. The whole aim of the method is to create in the spectator maximum excitement by the constant forcing of a question, such as in this case, will they be in time? This technique, he claims, was quite overdone to the point of being, well, a bit boring. Theoretically speaking, that is. He still acknowledges that it is very effective at heightening tensions. And finally, we come to leitmotif. This is a term that comes from Wagner's operas, where a musical piece is associated with a certain character. Even in movies, leitmotifs are generally seen that way. Think of the Indiana Jones theme, or the Imperial March that plays whenever Darth Vader shows up. Leitmotifs associate the sound with the character, creating an emotional connection. But Pudovkan saw leitmotifs as visual too. It can be used as a repeating shot that occurs throughout the film to give a certain impression. Like in the movie Jaws, for example, whenever we see the underwater shot, that's a leitmotif telling us that danger is nearby. So here you have it: contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. Again, no doubt you've thought up of many examples of these techniques in movies you've seen. Pudovkan's ideas are very influential. Don't believe me? Here's a quote. The first really useful book I read about filmmaking was The Film Technique by Pudovkan. This was some time before I had ever touched a movie camera, and it opened my eyes to cutting and montage. This quote comes from an obscure, unknown, unimportant director named Stanley Kubrick. That's right, the director of Clockwork Orange, The Shining, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and many others, credits Pudovkan's theories with helping him think about movie editing. So the next time you watch a Kubrick movie, think about the Soviet techniques you'll see: contrast, parallelism, symbolism, simultaneity, and leitmotif. So those were Pudovkan's editing techniques. Let's look at Eisenstein's 5 methods of montage. What you need to keep in mind was that Eisenstein was highly theoretical, and many have agonized over understanding the abstract methods that he was describing. I'll try my best, and hopefully you'll be able to recognize some of these methods. For Eisenstein, montage wasn't really about the edit. There was editing involved, sure, but it was more about the impressions that these methods gave. He saw in montage an example of dialectics. Dialectics is a concept most commonly associated with Hegel and Karl Marx, and to be extremely, and I want to emphasize how much of an oversimplification this is, extremely simple about it. Dialectics is the conflict of two ideas creating a new idea. So for Eisenstein, montage was not the smooth transition, but the crashing together of two images, creating an idea or impression in the audience that could not be represented on screen. Okay, hold up. Let me clarify. How could I represent a concept like hunger, for example? So you can have an actor on stage, they might rub their stomach, moan and complain about the lack of food, and all those other acting techniques. That would signal to the audience that what they're seeing is a hungry person. That's fine, but that's acting, not montage. In montage, the true meaning is in the juxtaposition of images. So we go back to Kuleshov experiments, where we have the image of a man, followed by a shot of a bowl of soup. There's no acting going on here. What's happening is that the audience sees one image, the figure of a man, followed by a second image, the soup, and they infer hunger based on the sequence. While Pudovkan's 5 editing techniques are independent of one another, Eisenstein's 5 techniques are built on each other. They become increasingly more abstract while also containing all the tones below it. Here they are from bottom to top: metric, rhythmic, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual. The meter of a movie is basically how long the camera will stay on a single shot. In most of our TV shows these days, and you can go count it, a single shot lasts for about 4 to 5 seconds on average. When the camera moves faster than that, you get the impression that something chaotic is happening. When the camera lingers for longer, the scene feels more dramatic and tense. The metric is usually determined by the director or by cinematic convention, regardless of the content of the individual scenes. You know how when you're watching a TV show or movie where the shots are longer, it makes the movie feel slower, possibly signaling that this is a serious movie or a prestigious TV show. Likewise, ever watch a film and the whole thing just feels off? This usually happens in amateur movies. The shots just seem all over the place, cutting at odd moments and not having any sense of timing. Eisenstein would say that this is because the cinematographer hasn't established the proper ratio of metric shots. Metric happens without consideration for content. That's what the rhythmic montage is for. Rhythmic montage, easily enough, establishes the rhythm of the movie based on what's happening on screen. This could be something as simple as cutting to the person talking when there's a conversation, or showing different kinds of motion in the scene to establish movements. In determining the length of the pieces, the content within the frame is a factor possessing equal rights to consideration. Metric and rhythmic montage combine together to create the tonal montage. This is the emotional resonance of the piece, the feeling that the shots are meant to create. Two or more shots can be emotionally connected through a visual or oral element that sets the tone of the piece. Eisenstein gives the example from his own movie where a thick fog is shown in different shots, creating an ominous feeling of the piece. Okay, now we're getting into much more abstract territory. Combining the previous three methods, we get the overtonal montage. This could be described as the theme behind the movie, the overall message displayed visually. Avant-garde or artsy movies are full of overtonal montage. Finally, the intellectual. Now we're getting into really abstract territory. The intellectual montage is an argument that the film is making. Ideology might be one way of describing it. The most famous example of intellectual montage is in Eisenstein's film October, where the general in the film announces, "In the name of God and country." And then we get shots of religious iconography that would be familiar to the Soviet audience, orthodox icons and crucifixes. But then the movie juxtaposes the familiar religious icons with different ones. Statues, idols, and fetishes from around the world, one that would appear alien to the audience who grew up on Orthodox doctrine, maybe even a bit frightening. The point of bringing together the familiar and the unfamiliar, right after the villain of the movie declares, "In the name of God and country," is a critique of the whole establishment. Cheesy? On the nose? Yeah, maybe. And Eisenstein might even have agreed with that assessment. He thought intellectual montage was not fully realized yet. For him, it was something that movies were developing towards, and those prospects really excited him. He believed that the full realization of movies, its true essence, would happen once the intellectual montage becomes the dominant form of movie making. I mean, looking at the movies we have today, that seems really ambitious. But our protagonists in this episode were nothing if not ambitious. If you're like me and of a certain age, watching movies of the 80s, the first thing that might come to mind when you hear montage is the training montage. The scene in action or martial arts movies where the protagonist, down on their luck and defeated, enters a grueling training regimen to the beat of a kick-ass inspirational song. Does the training montage have anything to do with Eisenstein's ideas? It might be hard to fit the two together, but let's give it a try. In the spirit of experimentation, let's see if the training montage actually fits with Eisenstein's methods. I'm about to create a movie training scene. It doesn't have to be anything too complex. Just imagine something along the lines of the Rocky movies. The hero has been humiliated at, pick a sport of choice, probably boxing or martial arts. Makes it more dramatic if the training involves getting ready for a fight. Much more conflict that way. So the opponent lays down the challenge. The protagonist has to get better in order to win. They grit their teeth. We cut to their eyes flashing with determination, and the electric guitar strikes its first chord. We're off to the montage. We see quick cuts of them doing exercises. We cut to a different shot, angle, or altogether different scene, all to the beat of the music. There is metric montage. Now we'll get the different forms of movements to fill each cut. The protagonist is running up a flight of stairs. They sprint down a hill. They come up from a sit-up or go down into a squat. The movement on screen will determine where the next shot will go. The rhythmic montage. Now we get shots of the protagonist sweating, gritting their teeth, collapsing in exhaustion after a grueling exercise. The feeling that creates is one of struggle and hardship. the tonal montage. But we can't just have our hero fail the whole time. The whole point of training is to get better. So our hero is trying to master a new move. Shots of them failing sets the first tone of hardship and struggle. But then, a revelation. They can do it. Quick shot from them struggling to them triumphing. We've moved from one feeling to another, creating the theme of overcoming. Here is the overtonal montage. All this leads to the most complex form, the intellectual montage. Is there really any intellectual montage in what I've described above? Let me try and propose something. So the intellectual montage is a visual argument, right? The argument here, I would say, is the ideology of self-help. You can do it if you try hard enough. Hustle and you will succeed. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The entire training montage is screaming slogans at you, louder than any Tony Robbins seminar could. Of course, Eisenstein was living in the USSR in the 1920s and wasn't interested in 1980s American bootstrap ideology. His montages were used to show struggle and triumph of the proletariat against the Tsarist regime. One way that people compare Pudovkan and Eisenstein is to say that the former was more subjective, humanistic, and the latter more theoretical and intellectual. There's some truth to that. All you have to do is watch Pudovkan's The End of St. Petersburg and Eisenstein's October to get a feeling for what the two were doing differently. Both movies deal with the final days of the old regime and the rise of the Bolsheviks. The End of St. Petersburg follows a down-on-his-luck worker who moves to the city and is engaged in a long, protracted strike against his capitalist boss that eventually merges into the larger social conflict. It's a much more conventional way of telling a story, more psychological and focused on a protagonist. Eisenstein's October is much grander and much more historical. He drew inspiration from the book October, The 10 Days That Shook the World by American journalist John Reed. John Reed, by the way, was subject of Warren Beatty's film Reds, which won him Best Director in the 80s. October doesn't follow a single protagonist. It shows instead the different events that lead up to the revolution. It focuses on historical events, the crowds, the masses, and the people. An image that Pudovkan uses when we get to St. Petersburg is a shot of the horse statue in the city. It's an extreme shot from below, making the statue seem gigantic. It is oppressive. You couldn't really imagine Eisenstein making a shot like that. Instead, he would probably put together images that give the historical or ideological deconstruction of that statue. Eisenstein and Pudovkan, they complement each other well. Both come with two different takes on editing and montage. Both are indispensable in our understanding of filmmaking. Zika Vertov fits a bit awkwardly in our story, since he's been around for a long time but always on the sidelines. That's probably because he was always a bit of an outsider from the industry, never quite fitting in. He was too avant-garde even for the avant-gardists. Vertov was the most forceful in his views on new art. He was an admirer of the Russian Futurists, a group of artists who, even before the revolution, wanted to recreate art to fit the modern world. They would, for example, strip poetry of its content and play with a form. So that means instead of focusing on what a poem really means, the focus of the art would be on the sound symbolism, on the play of words, or even on the fonts. Vertov, in the same way, wanted to strip movies of what he thought was the holdover from theater and literature. Theaters focus on psychological drama, on individual characters with individual struggles, on stories of domestic strife and internal conflict. Well, all of that was just way too bougie for Vertov, too sentimental, didn't really reflect the reality of the modern world. The modern world was much more impersonal and mechanistic. Don't get me wrong though, for Vertov that was a good thing. The futurist tendencies in him saw all of this as an opportunity to reinvent how we saw the world, and how art should reflect the world. He coined the term kino eye, the cinema eye. The emphasis for Vertov was on the camera apparatus itself. It was the eye that managed to see things that we weren't able to see with our own eyes. Camera and all the editing techniques that make cinema would let us see truths and perspectives that were impossible before. Vertov started off as a newsreel maker. During the Civil War, he was creating the short documentaries that would board the Agit trains. After the trains, he kept rolling out newsreels called Kinopravdas, Cinema Truths. And it was in working so intimately with this realistic genre that he began to form his ideas on style. Now, things can get a little confusing here. We think of things like the eye of the camera and cinema truths and think that Vertov was just letting the camera roll and picking up whatever. But for Vertov, the truths that the machine perceives also included the edits. Just like the futurists wanted you to focus less on the meaning of a painting and more on getting a fresh perspective on shapes, colors, and brushstrokes, so did Vertov want you to focus on cinematic techniques. And that brings us to Vertov's most famous work, Man with a Movie Camera. In terms of plot, well, there isn't. In terms of plot, well, there isn't any. It's a series of montages following people as they go about on their daily lives in a city. This was actually a genre of movie back then called the City Symphony. But Man with a Movie Camera takes the genre to the next level. It is a masterclass of cinematic techniques. Practically every single technique imaginable is deployed to depict the day in the life. You got montage, close-ups, zoom effects, slow motion, fast motion, stop motion, double exposure, and much, much more. No plot, no characters, no emotional arc, no themes. All setting, all techniques. This is pretty heady, and you can see why stuff like this made Vertov an outsider. But his contributions to cinema are still recognized. All the way up to the 50s, Pudovkan, Eisenstein, and Vertov were hailed as some of the best cinematographers to ever live. Man with a Movie Camera is still included in lists of best movies ever made. I would argue that Vertov's legacy lives on in the avant-garde, in art house cinema. His ideas of a more impersonal cinema and an emphasis on cinematic technique still informs a lot of the more experimental and independent movies to this day. In fact, Kino Pravda was later translated to French, Cinéma Vérité, and became a new art movement in itself in France. The last person in our group, Alexander Davjenko, is a bit of a latecomer to the story. He was making movies throughout the 20s, but only started receiving critical acclaim in 1928. His most famous works were what is now known as the Ukrainian trilogy, Zhveni Gora, Arsenal, and Earth. Davjenko and Vertov stand on polar ends in their use of montage. If Vertov was a futurist poet focusing on form, Davjenko was a lyrical poet with rich meaning behind each shot. His montages are deep in symbolism, most of which he drew from Ukrainian folktales and folk beliefs. The movie Earth opens with an old peasant man dying. It depicts the scene with long shots of Ukrainian landscapes, of the sky, of the old man drifting in and out of consciousness, of an apple, of the people surrounding him, and their different reactions to his passing. Each shot lingers on these details, giving you the impression that there is a lot of meaning to each shot. It's hypnotic to watch. Davjenko's use of folk symbols and national imagery drew a lot of criticism at the time, but he had a very unlikely defender. More on that next episode. Kuleshov, Pudovkan, Vertov, Davjenko, Eisenstein. These filmmakers rocked the world with their new and innovative film techniques. Filmmakers across Europe praised the style, would-be revolutionaries praised the content, and governments of Europe were definitely not amused. When October was released in Berlin, it caused quite a stir and the authorities were keen on banning it. This pleased the Soviet authorities, and the film gained even more notoriety and acclaim, with the authorities and film critics, that is. But what about the ordinary Soviet man and woman on the streets? Well, when October came out in January, it didn't stay very long in theaters, because it was overshadowed by another film that wowed Soviet audiences. The film? Robin Hood, a Hollywood movie. Hollywood imports were still big in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and it was clear that audiences preferred the less demanding movies that were coming from America. It was only when October caused a stir in Berlin, with the movie critics heaping praise upon the film and the capitalist authorities scrambling to get it banned, that Soviet critics paid attention. Because of this international acclaim, October was screened again in the USSR in the summer of that year, only to be beaten in the box office by a rescreening of Robin Hood. Reception of these industry-defining films was mixed, to say the least. Here's a satirical poem that might illustrate the mood. Who praises it? The film writer and the party member praise it, but the Soviet man in the street is dissatisfied and scandalized. And here's even harsher criticism. In the countryside, the films were not understood, And it must be said that the more widely the Soviet cinema develops, the greater will be the percentage of films that are completely incomprehensible to the peasantry. I am talking about a film like October. There's nothing to be said about Svenigora, which we all had the misfortune to see. Ouch. The party took note of this mood. In the 1928 meeting, there were numerous speeches given about the state of Soviet cinema. They argued that the films were ideologically sound. They promoted good Soviet values. But all that meant nothing if the audience couldn't understand the movies or didn't want to see them. A new slogan was unrolled: Cinema for the Millions, a call to make movies that still retained the ideology but had a wider appeal. The word we would use today is mainstream. This doesn't mean, however, that experimental cinema was gone overnight. After all of these calls came in 1928, and Vertov released Man with a Movie Camera, perhaps the most experimental and least accessible of the movies mentioned, in 1929. Experimentation was still kicking for a while. That would not last much longer, since the behind-the-scenes political intrigue in the party was about to explode on the scene. Lenin passed away in 1924, and much political maneuvering was happening in those years. The 1928 party meeting was expressing concern about cinema, but that was just a small part of the wider plan for the party to impose tighter control over the art and the culture of the Soviet Union. Because now, we're about to enter a new era. The NEP and experimental movies were about to come to an end, giving way to 5-year plans, socialist realism, and Stalin.